Welcome back. We are joined today by Henry Tillman, the founder of Asia Investment Research and the CEO of Ayana Research. So thank you for coming back yet again on the program. I've been looking forward to speak with you now about the Northern Sea Route. I watched your presentation of this. That is, the Northern Sea Route, of course, is the Arctic corridor developed by Russia, and as it's increasingly referred to in China as the Polar Silk Road. As as the world is becoming consumed by chaos and war, the development of the Arctic corridor hasn't really stopped. It continues to develop. So let me start it off with an introductory question to this topic, which is, what is your background to this? How did you develop an interest and expertise in this Arctic corridor, and also what is the wider, I guess, geostrategic relevance of this Arctic maritime corridor? Why should we care, and what does it mean for politics? Sorry, very big question.
I was going to say there are at least three components of that question. Let us start with the basics of it. So, my children's grandfather was a senior politician in Canada. It started taking me to the Arctic in the mid '90s. So I've been photographing the Arctic and icebergs and such for the last 30 years from Canada across to Russia. So that goes back up, I said 30 years. And so from the period of 2007 to 2013, I photographed a number of dying icebergs across the west coast of Africa, because obviously Monaco had been looking at this, IKEA Foundation had been looking at this. So I started tracking them over the years. And over that period of time, I then used those photographs to film a small film I did, and I put that's all a loop with Callas singing Lana Morta. I happen to know Callas is chairman. So I decided this year, because of Greenland, to open that film here at the Brighton Fringe. But I also added a few slides to pick up what you're talking about on the NSR, and of course the effects of the NSR and energy prices and shipping. So that's the bridge. And because I knew so much about that, spending so much time in Greenland, when it came to 2018, I'm one of the three co-authors of the Polar Silk Road piece that people still refer to every day. That's the Chinese government with SIIS, a researcher from Iceland, and myself. And I brought the commercial angle to that thing. So that got me kicked off into it. And so when the chairman of the Arctic Circle, former president of Iceland, heard this, he said, wait a minute, you need to talk about this in a bigger forum, because it's that huge geopolitical ramification. So for a period from 2019 to 2023, I presented every year at the Arctic Circle in Reykjavik every October, starting with 2019 with the discussion of who's where with respect to icebreakers, to 2021, which gets into the economics of this, because basically it's so much cheaper. I use Russian publicly available Russian numbers to show how much cheaper it is to get it out of the ground, and how competitive Russia was at the time, plus how much faster the shipping time is. Only 18 days from the Vladivostok to London, versus 35 days through Hormuz and 50 days to the south of Africa. So it's not only cheaper to get it out of the ground by multiples, it's also less expensive to ship. That was 21. And 23, as you and I discussed before, I presented on thorium. So I have 5 years of presenting on this, of the development of the northern, that is the NSR, I should call it. So what's happened from that is, I thought, like, that's the first piece of it. That's my background, how I got into it. I still live with it every day. I was part of the old discussions on Kirkenes, why I didn't get in, why I did get in, all things to do with that. So I'd like to make the second part of your question is, what are the components of this, right? So the first component is, of course, receding ice, right? The ice and the Arctic ice has receded by 50% since the 1970s. That's incredible. And to me, it's warming 4 times faster than the rest of the areas. There's a natural movement away from the shoreline and up higher and higher as it shrinks. There's more and more ability to commercialize this without destroying the ice. So what has happened because of that? First of all, you've had countries that have actually specialized in commercializing this. Russia leads this with icebreakers. So Russia has over 40 icebreakers. They have 8 nuclear icebreakers. And China has icebreakers, but they're still building a nuclear icebreaker and acting nuclear cargo ship, a major nuclear cargo ship. Russia and China combined have more icebreakers than NATO combined. So that's a powerful force. Now, this is surprising because, as you talked before we started, Russia has historically represented 65% of the population of all the Arctic. So it's been always, and over 50% of the landmass of the Arctic. So Russia has always been in charge of the Arctic, basically historically, population and landmass. So therefore, it's a bit specious for the argument that Russia is now finding the Arctic because they've been around for decades, right? And that's us. So I wanted to show that was not the case. The Chinese icebreakers have been more research icebreakers that they've not really been in what did heavy shipping as Russia has been. Although last year China decided to build an icebreaker, not a research icebreaker, actually a tourist icebreaker. It could be a cargo ship and also high-end tourism to get into the Arctic, because depending on what you believe timetable is, that ice could shrink substantially in the next 10 years when more people are saying it's gone by 2050. Yeah, which is pretty substantial. Already the flows are picking up because it's now usable 4.5 months of the year. Last year, for example, in 2025, closes in mid-November. And last year, we've seen 103 passages versus 85 passages a couple of years before that, but bigger than that. It's double the tonnage. So you had 38 million tons last year versus 18 million tons in 2018. So there's more and more use of it. There's use back and forth. It is mostly Russian LNG. It's not surprising to you. So you have receding ice, increased technology in icebreakers, and therefore increased traffic. Yes. And then you throw in the last part of your question, what's happening in the world today? Yes. So it won't surprise you that because, especially the last few months, Russia has been working very hard and linking itself to many other countries, as you said, going east versus west. West is all dried up. We talked about this before, that because of the high cost of energy, you have European countries that were using lower cost LNG have moved away from using that in the West. And actually, to BASF this year, opening its major 10 billion plant in China using Russian LNG. We looked at German green hydrogen companies looking partnering with China in China. So you're seeing the West being able to use that technology, that low cost energy in China. Actually in China versus the West. So therefore, the good news travels quickly. So you've seen a number of countries in the last few months alone partner with Russia in rapidly developing this NSR, but also something bigger. It's a trans-Arctic corridor. So you would know this from the debates happening between St. Petersburg and links to Tehran and links all and way to land routes to India. And of course, sea routes from India across into Vladivostok across the top of the world. So you have the NTSC, as you know. That's a major play for India. So in essence, with an Indian play, it's a full loop, as I just described. India can then power itself with lower cost Russian LNG. By the way, when I presented this in 21, 4 months before the war started, at the time, Russia was just number 2 behind Qatar in LNG production. People forget that in 2004, when Putin took a bet that he'd be able to do this in Siberia in 2004. By 2021, he was number 2 behind Qatar in LNG production. That's a pretty great story. It's been slowed, obviously, for other reasons we know. But people realize how far it's come, and it continues to build. So India is the first one of these last year and early in this year, that loop I just told you about. So the rail route is St. Petersburg down to Tehran, across India around the top. The port I talked about before, I was involved with Kirkenes, as you know, from Norway, that didn't get passed. And so China said, fine. And Russia's come to the grips, fine. We're not going to get We're not going to do that. So they've decided to China's decided to put $2.5 billion into Archangel, which is a major port. It's a very special port for Russia, historic port for Russia. So it's the closest one to Norway. So they've gone that direction. So you've had China with a ports upgrade. You've had Russia with India on ports upgrade, yes, and logistics upgrade. You've had a loop of more power, low-cost power to India. And also, that's Russia and India, which we were talking about. Also, in the last 2 months, Russia signed big shipping and marine deals and NSR deals with Malaysia, in Vietnam in May, and also recently to Indonesia. And just a few days ago, a deal with Saudi, with ports and also NSR, of course, Iran. So if you look at how this is all moving east, the West has all been shut off because of sanctions, and therefore higher energy prices because of this. So Russia's a pivot to Asia. And I've also seen the same thing true with Asia and the pivot to Russia, as you know. As you just said, I write Asia Investor Research. The last two features we've done, one is with Thailand and one is with Malaysia, and both of those show a leaning towards Asia. But the point is, this is all developing very quickly, and as you rightly point out, part of this is related to this acceleration. As part of this is due to what's happening in the Gulf. People want more secure lines and diversify the resources. So I hope that answers. And I maybe close with one more piece of this. It's not we to finish what we did last August when we talked about how Kremikov and RIC was coming together with nuclear power. Yes, so in essence, as we said before, so Russia, India, and China are working together, collaborating on nuclear power, state nuclear power, who builds what, who's connected to what. The same thing is happening here with shipping. Same thing is happening with logistics. Same thing is happening with ports. It's a coming together, supporting with infrastructure, logistics, and power, energy and power, low-cost power. So I hope I answered your very complex, multi-part question. But that's how I got into it. That's all the different components within and how it's moving so quickly. And now the acceleration, which you raised a few minutes ago. So I hope that addresses your points.
Yeah. No, well, I initially took a very big interest in the Arctic during a book I was writing in 2015. I called it Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia, and essentially it was about what happened after the Western-backed regime change in Ukraine, because this put an end to Russia's previous, Greater Europe initiative, which had kind of continued since Gorbachev's idea of a common European home. Anyways, as all of Russia's economy is being reoriented from the west to the east, I thought the Arctic was quite fascinating because, well, all the other Arctic states are Western powers, and now all of them are NATO powers. And Russia always prioritized cooperation with the West in order to gradually integrate into this greater Europe. But now, of course, since 2014, they began to replace greater Europe with greater Eurasia. Now you see all its main partners being countries in the east. So this is quite quite extraordinary. But as you said, they hold most of the Arctic territories. They can, cooperate with whomever they want. But the fact that the Chinese, the Indians are all becoming all de facto Arctic powers, it's quite a fascinating development. But also because a core of U.S. strategy, at least since World War II, but you can go back to Alfred Mann as well, has been much like the British. If you control the seas, that's essentially a key source of power. But this maritime corridor, it's outside US control, but it's also faster, it's cheaper. This is why I thought it was a great mistake for the West to essentially divorce itself from Russia or make an enemy out of Russia, because the Arctic appears to be growing in relevance. And as you said, Trump seems to have woken up to this, and he makes every now and then he has a speech about how unfair it is that Russia has more icebreakers. But how do you see this in the wider now, I guess, context of China? Because for people who follow the geography, the Arctic waters between Western Europe, that is where Norway is, and Russia, is called the Barents Sea. The reason it's called the Barents is because in the beginning of in the 16th century, when, after the ancient Silk Road had collapsed, the Western powers, or European maritime powers, reconnected the world. This has kind of started the 500 years of Western dominance. But one of those routes were trying to connect with China through the Arctic. And Dutchman Willem Barents tried to connect through the Arctic. He got stuck in Nova Zemlya and died. But anyways, that's why it's called the Barents Sea. But now, of course, a few centuries later, that connectivity is being established. However, not under European or Western control, but now as a Russian or Eurasian project. So how do you see this fitting into the wider Eurasian development?
Yeah, multi-level question. So maybe address two small pieces of them first. This goes back to 2018, where it was in the original piece you're referring to. I would argue that it's the sanctions that were placed on Russia which accelerated this. It's the U.S. harsh use of sanctions that originally pushed the button or accelerated the launch of the polar silk. It's part of a number of Silk Roads, but this was, I would argue, that was part of their to accelerate. You needed the Chinese, and Russia needed Chinese capital. They still need Chinese capital. As I said, China is rebuilding Archangel. And of course, as we talked about before, with Rosatom, many countries are using, Russian companies are using public markets or renminbi bonds, basically, to finance this stuff. So it started in 28. I argue it started in 2014, which has led to the launch of this. With respect to U.S. icebreakers, I said this, they have more than half icebreakers. One of those is 70 years old. It's used for peak parts. I personally went after the U.S. on this point in 2019, publicly in front of 2,000 people in Reykjavik. So I spoke to, and when President Trump signed with Finland in October last year, I sent a note to Olafur Grimsson, who runs the Arctic Circle. I said, Olafur, we finally got him to move. And he wrote back and said, no, Henry, you got him to move. So they signed with Finland. Now those are standard icebreakers. They're not nuclear icebreakers. They're also talking to Korea. But as you rightfully point out, all that stuff that goes with today's world with Korea and the issues with U.S. manufacturing and all the stuff we read about, that's also kind of some other stock. To the geopolitical macro piece of this stuff, you'll recognize the countries we'll talk about here along with the BRICS. Yes. And so it doesn't surprise you that this is all part of something much, much bigger. And that it's in a multipolar world, which you and I have been talking about for years. Yeah, and so it's a spreading of all this wealth and lower reduction cost, building supply lines, the supply chains for all these different countries that are not dependent on the places where there's risk. And of course, that goes with currencies as well, which you've already talked about. So it's a massive shift. But again, I think it's all interrelated. As I said, Clint, I don't think this is just energy. I mean, we talk about with nuclear energy, but it's all ports, logistics. Think about this for a second. That India-Russia loop has nothing to do with the West. Zero. We just did a piece, I've a series of websites, I mentioned two of those. I did the piece for another government that finished in March. That if you look at look at Hungary. The Hungary investments from China the last 2 years are been leading years. That yes, true, but you have to look at it differently because the actual first investments in Hungary in 2005. It was a 30-year place where China said we're going to do this over 30 years, and they've done it. By 2035, that's a very integrated logistics hub in Hungary. The same thing is happening now with Spain and with Morocco. So in essence, if you build hubs in Hungary and you build hubs fully integrated hubs in those places, and Spain and Morocco, you don't really need to go to Europe anymore, do you? At all. That's why Europe, if you want to play, you want to go the other direction to play. So then there's no attack on this. It's just you minimize sanctions, and so you want to keep pounding people with sanctions, and they're going to look options. That's my argument. I'm not a geopolitician. I'm a data guy, and I'm a scientist. But it just seems to me logical.
No, but that's a key rule of sanctions, though. If usually the lesson is if they are severe and expand over time, then countries will simply to learn to live with it. And I think that's what you're seeing. And learning to live with sanctions, that means decoupling. So this is the irony, because the sanctions were supposed to isolate the Russians, but what we see is they're isolating Europe, because, as you said, if people or countries are now figuring out, well, we don't really need Europe then at all, and once you begin to decouple from the Europe as a physical corridor, why use their insurances? Why follow their energy markets? Why use their currencies? Why their banks? Or why then link up with their industries and technologies? And suddenly, I mean, this was the lessons of the ancient Silk Road. Wherever the trade was going, that's where the great civilizations were emerging. And once it once it broke down, places like Central Asia became less relevant, became economic backwaters, while the countries that reconnected the world, that is the Western Europeans and later the Americans, that's where power was concentrated. So this is why, for me, the fact that the sanctions are always introduced, with cheers and beating of the drums and and a patriotic, patriotic mood is quite extraordinary, because I don't think they understand what they're doing. They are isolating themselves. They're undermining their own position in the world. It's essentially fueling this shift in the where the main economic power will be in the future. It's very strange, and especially this point in time for the Arctic, because for so many years the Arctic was essentially considered to be a frozen desert. It didn't have that much value. During the Cold War, it's largely exempted from great power rivalry, and it was a place for positive sum cooperation, trust building, research, all of this. But now the ice is receding. We're seeing this massive energy resources, opening up transportation corridors. A lot of geopolitical or geoeconomic power is shifting. And the first thing we do in the West is to cut ourselves off from it. I mean, and as I watched you saying your speech as well, that is when the Germans, for example, cut themselves off from the Russian gas, that gas was redirected to China. Well, the politicians can't control the shifts, the geoeconomic shifts. So the German companies, they follow the Russian gas. So they pack up and leave Germany and go to China then. I mean, this is the idea that they can control all these forces. It's absurd. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons you see countries like Germany going into decline. But
May I raise one more point?
yeah, please.
Because you're a historian, I love history as well. So the same client said, would you look at what's happening with Spain? And they said, look at what's happening the last 2 years in Spain. So I decided I wanted to do more than that. I went back to the Silver Silk Road. As what with Spain goes back to the 16th century. For 350 years, it went from Shaman through Manila, to the Yucatan Peninsula, and then to Spain. So suddenly people say, look at 2 years, because that's this government wants a short period of time to look at the data. And I said, no. This is in about 2 years. This goes back 350 years. And since they can't run it through Yucatan Peninsula anymore, they're running it through Peru. Yes, it goes to Spain and it goes south to Morocco and then across the west, all the way to the west of Africa, which has really some fantastic third and fourth generation ports. 5G AI port in Senegal. 5G AI port in Senegal. Amazing. Yes. So there's no Europe, but it goes back 350 years, as you just said. The people look at 2 years, not 350 years.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I didn't want to, suggest that the Arctic corridor will somehow take over all the trade in the world or replace the Suez Canal. But I think that's the whole point of this new Silk Road. The Silk Road was never one road. It was a diversified, system, many roads. And I think, the Arctic can absorb some of this. That is, be one of many corridors. But as you mentioned, it's also complemented by, for example, the international north-south transportation corridor from Russia, Iran to India, as well as the multitude of projects pushed by the Chinese under the Belt and Road Initiative. But On the what are the limitations though on this Northern Sea Route cargo volumes? Because we've seen it grown since 2018, but what are the main drivers and the limitations in terms of how big this can get? And I just add, I do know that it's complemented by the energy trade, of course, which is what you and I usually speak about when you're on this program.
I think the ice melt will go much faster. I think what we're seeing, I mean, I didn't talk about the third pole, maybe the North Pole, South Pole, and the third pole. The third pole is even melting even faster. This ice melt is changing the world, right? And people don't see it. So I've seen forecasts saying there's no ice by 2050 on the North Pole. I think it's interesting. China's building a nuclear icebreaker for tourism. How about that? I mean, high-end tourism to go to the North Pole. So I see this change. I see that ice melt continuing to go rapid. Yes, unfortunately, I wish I felt differently because I'm the guy that photographs dying icebergs. So, but I see that continuing. I wish that were the case, but the more people embrace what we talked about before, thorium power, which is coming. You know, we've been told that Ling Long 1 is not thorium, will be commercial this year. And and since there were 5 countries which this is about land-based SMRs, commercial SMRs. Since there are 5 countries been testing 10 to 30 megawatt Chinese SMRs, it's only a matter of time before those first 5 get their SMRs. So it's coming. It's coming quickly, but you know how fast it can mitigate what's happening on the north. I don't know. Can't answer that question.
Yeah. Well, Russia, though, it's expanding now this Arctic cooperation. Initially, it was focused a lot on China, but I guess a key feature of this whole Greater Eurasia initiative for Russia is it should diversify. That is, don't put all your eggs in only the Chinese basket because their economic power is well, it's not the same, and so they want to have many roads, many corridors. So they also now expanding cooperation with countries like India, Indonesia, which again is I think is a very underestimated maritime power, which will be huge in the future. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Vietnam, and others. What are the wider strategic objectives you think of Moscow pursuing these partnerships? Because in geoeconomics, we usually see, the economic interests going hand in hand with the political or wider strategic interest.
Spot on. I mean, so it's again, that's linked. If you many of these, as you know, Russia leads the world in floating nuclear. They've been floating nuclear since 2019, right? And then they're in many countries. So what we haven't discussed today is the number of Asian countries talking to Russian nuclear power, safe nuclear power. Many of these countries are discussions with Russia, Vietnam, Thailand, throughout Asia, and also throughout the Latin America. It's linked, and also it's linked to military, as you rightfully suggest. Yes. So the linkages are much greater than just shipping and ports and logistics. It's hard to put that, right? You build everything off the base, a logistical base, a power base. You got to power your country. And if you look at Asian countries, whether it's Russian power, Chinese, India, Russian thorium down the road, that's going to drive these countries. As you just said, with German major companies or major countries, they've got to figure out how to power their countries. The penny hasn't dropped yet. My head of data centers in the U.S. is over in the UK this week. We're seeing company after company. And it's the obvious answer. There's huge growth in many of these countries in data centers and semiconductors, and people have come to grips with that. You don't have power to run these things. Yes, so you got to run your country, and then that's what's driving this. So the cheap energy infrastructure to get it there, that's going to drive it. But then you build, many other relationships on top of that energy, as in geopolitics, as in defense, etc. This is the base. Energy is the base. In my opinion.
Yeah. No, I very much agree with that. But how do you see any possibilities of bringing in essentially a Western component into this? I mean, the US appears to be a little bit pragmatic. It seems to hope that if it shuffle or outsource the Ukraine war to the Europeans, that it can improve the bilateral relations with the Russians. But again, it would be, I guess, good to see a region like the Arctic being something for positive sum security instead of only this zero sum rivalry. But well, for the Europeans, they just escalated now with announcing they will further start targeting Russian shipping. So I think, yeah, they look like they will be essentially excluded from all Arctic work and Arctic cooperation. But do you see any other possibilities? I will hope I'm wrong, but do you see the U.S. or hopefully also the Europeans having any interest or any push towards using the Arctic to improve relations again?
Too. In fact, I watched an interview from a U.S. Think tank at St. Petersburg last weekend. The U.S. has $100 billion still invested in today in Russia. It's not a small number. Businesses, right? And there's a number for the first time in St. Petersburg this time. Last weekend, there were a number of U.S. companies that turned up. So I see a rapprochement somewhere down the road commercially, as you said, it's commercially. There's because there's so much talent in Russia, right? In energy and nuclear and across all kinds of technologies, right? Which both attract investment. So I see the U.S. investing, getting much closer, as you talked about before. If you have these orbs, there's a Primakov orb and there's a Western orb, Eurasian Primakov orb, not a Russian Primakov orb. It's Eurasian. And I see those orbs collaborating, not competing. But I mean, I could be too optimistic there. But down the road, I see cooperation. And so I do see the U.S. being a bigger part of Russia going forward. And I think Germany over time will be more so. And I think Italy will be more so. I can't speak country by country, but in the interim, you have Western companies, Western countries, whether it's Hungary or whether it's Spain, saying, "Wait a minute, there's more growth someplace else than you guys, and more palatable."
Yeah, I tend to be of the opinion that well, the economic interests, they will shape political interest
Well,
over
that's what we're
time.
saying, right? Where
Yeah.
that is.
Well, the failure to adjust politics to economic interest usually comes with a punishment, and I think you will see this in Europe. That is when the German government attempts to explain to its population why it's beneficial to buy Russian energy from India with a heavy markup. It's very difficult to sell this point. So I think once these countries do not actually address their basic national interests and direct policies accordingly, they see economic decline, deindustrialization, and that will result in some social upheaval. You have the public growing more dissatisfied with their governments, and if you want to look at an example of this, look towards the approval ratings of Merz, Macron, and Starmer, and at some point then opposition emerges in that vacuum who actually addresses the interests. That is, perhaps we should buy Russian energy, which is many times cheaper than the alternative we're buying now. This will sort of let us rebuild our economies, be relevant. The world will take us serious again, and we could have prosperity and security. But I think we're not there yet.
I'd say some tongue in cheek. I would say, if you're looking at a 2-year period where you're running the country, you can just keep the frog in the pot. Just turn up the heat slightly, but don't let the frog jump out of the pot. And so that's what's happening, right? Prices go up, Look how that's being finessed in the stock markets today, right? We know if you look at the numbers underneath that, they're quite scary when it comes to fertilizer, when it comes to helium, whatever. That's not being discussed in any place. And the Western press isn't going to cover that. And turkeys don't book for Christmas.
Well, I was going to say, now that the Europeans are trying to block fertilizers, Russian energy, again, targeting Russian shipping in Europe, and also we see the Middle East shutting down over the war against Iran. And again, the consequence for the Gulf states could be disastrous. How do you see this fueling then the Northern Sea route? Do you think it benefits to a large extent, but because there's also some disconnect, that is, it's these massive disruptions. It's usually not only good for the rival corridors.
So I just look at the facts. I mean, if you see the Vietnam, Indonesia, Saudi deals with Russia have happened in May and June. So what's that tell you about what's happening with that source of energy and stability in the last part of 3 months? Russia's been very keen to build these partnerships of ports and logistics with these three countries. These are three major countries. I mean, Vietnam's down to plus million people, right? Indonesia's circa 300 million people, and of course there's Saudi. These are massive, it's 500 million people, right? In the last 2 months, partnering with Russia, saying we want other options. I see that continuing. I hope Iran gets settled. I don't have a great deal of expectation over the near term, but who knows? I hope so. And as long as there's worries that you have to diversify your flow. I think there are many countries that, because we track all this investment data, we find investment data from all over the world. People are balancing they're not linking themselves to one country. Uzbekistan's done a great job. Malaysia's done a great job. Thailand's done a great job of balancing in investment. Yep. So it's the same with energy. Even more so with energy, I would say, because it's more near term, and that's what we've seen right now. I mean, some of these Asian countries have relied on Qatar or LNG. I mean, that's very difficult for the next few years, right? You got to find options.
Well, let me ask a last question. If again you're a data guy, you look at the numbers. If the current trends continue, how different do you think the Arctic trade patterns would look like by 2030, 2035 compared to what it is today? I mean, how do you see this? Yeah, the direction is going.
I think that all we know is that we have Russia, US, Korea, Japan, and building icebreakers to get more of this, be more part of this. I think it's fair comment to say there's loads of different routes being built. This will be an increasing role, definitely, because it's so much cheaper. I mean, the numbers in 2021, I don't have updated numbers now, but when I presented this in 2021, Russian LNG at Yamal was 4 times less expensive West, and half the price, half the shipping time. So you do the math. Significant, right? And it will always be significantly less, because basically it's only 18 days for us to talk about Russia. That's it. And oh, by the way, their whole false flag about you got to get Greenland because it's being attacked by Russia and China. First of all, to get from the east coast of England, where I live, to west coast of Greenland, you got to go out the east coast, across Scotland, across Ireland, across Iceland to get to the other side of Greenland. So I really don't see Russia or the NSR being a major player in, if you will, Russia or China attacking Greenland. That was the false flag I wanted to raise here in a small village, whether south of England.
Yeah, no, but no, I'll agree. I think no one really took that too serious. Well, it was a bit sad to see the German chancellor repeat this, that, well, America has a real interest in Greenland to protect it from a Chinese or Russian invasion. It's quite absurd, but
the Arctic, the Russians control the Arctic. 65% of the population in the Arctic for decades. So what's new? What are they going to take? What are they going to take? They haven't done already.
Yeah. No, well, I think for the Americans, the first time they wanted to express an interest in buying Greenland was the same time as they were acquiring Alaska. So I think it's a good outpost to control the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. So I see it as an American attempt to prepare for a multipolar world to, I guess, defend the Western Hemisphere, or control it at least. But but of course that's not a nice sales pitch. So I think looking to defend it. I mean, this is more likely, yeah, the how they will approach this matter, at least in the media. But when I saw the European leaders, celebrate how they cut themselves off, or are cutting themselves off completely from Russian energy. That is, the Russian energy you're saying is 4 times cheaper than the Russian gas. It's I found it to be so extraordinary because, I was taught that energy security meant the supply of cheap, reliable energy. And to have cheap, reliable energy, you usually want to diversify your suppliers. That is, by all means, don't get excessively dependent on Russian supplies, because then, if that's not reliable, they can be used politically. The prices can be hiked, but you want many. But to cut yourself off and then make yourself excessively dependent, for example, on an American supplier only, then there's no energy security. Then it's not reliable, it's not cheap. It's extraordinary to me. This is, but I guess my source of optimism is you can only do this for so long before you're forced to accept reality. And I think that's where we're reaching now in Europe. You see political opposition to this madness emerge. We're at the stage now, I think, where they're just trying to criminalize or marginalize the opposition, as we've seen, from France to Germany. But at some point, that just angers, and you can only ignore reality for so long. But hopefully, at least speaking as a European, I would like to see the Arctic become an area of actual cooperation between all the major powers, as opposed to having this zero-sum dimension to it. But
maybe one more thing to think about, just to put on the table. The third pole of these countries with 8,000 meters, that ice melt is very rapid. That's going to have a near-term effect on the stands of C5, C6 countries, right? But more importantly, that ice melt out of Tibet, right? As Chinese are building a river in Western China, which will be the size of the Yangtze, to actually, from that ice melt, from that glacier melt, to actually make that desert go green. Yes, they're building a river the size of the Yangtze out of the ice flow out of Tibet, out of the mountains, and that will actually turn that whole area green, and therefore their need to get food from elsewhere in the world will change. So all these things are happening with this ice melt, and there's no Western press covering it, for all the reasons you just said.
Yeah, well, that's a media problem, I noticed. The media is very narrative driven. If it doesn't present a good story about winning, or then it essentially just disappears. At least there was a story also, on the topic of maritime routes and energy when the Nord Stream was destroyed. Everyone remembers the massive interest by the media, as long as it could be portrayed as being, Russia attacking its own pipeline. Once it became evident it was either the United States or Ukraine or both, there was no good narrative anymore. So they just throw out a story about a fishing boat and then just let it go, and no interest anymore. So yeah, I think that could be the same curse of ignoring what's happening in the Arctic.
Well, anyway, thanks for having me on. I just want to show this is how rapidly this is changing. It's changed. I've given you statistics between 18 and 25, but the last 3 months or 4 months with India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Saudi, this is all rapid movement, right? These are major countries. I guess all these together represent 2 billion people. Since May, that's pretty quick change.
Yeah. And I would also advise people to, I'll link this video up to the discussion we had about thorium, because I found this to be quite fascinating and also very important for people to know. So thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope you come back again soon.
Okay, good to see you as ever. Thanks so much. Bye now.